Right, good morning to the A to Z of writing language learning materials. Today we have Ben Goldstein with me, who's going to talk about his new book on inclusion, which is published by Cambridge University Press, 30 Ideas on Inclusion in ELT. Really pleased that Ben could join me. Ben, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and why you wrote this
hmm
book?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks very much, John, for inviting me for this chat. And so I'm ELT materials writer and conference speaker, teacher trainer. I've been living in Spain for over 30 years, published quite a lot of materials. In fact, I think you and I have quite a lot in common because we mainly have worked in the adult segment. So most of the materials I've written are for adults and young adults. And recently with Cambridge, have published a lot with them, methodology handbooks, one on I was very interested some years ago in using images, visual literacy. That was the first Cambridge teacher's handbook that I wrote. And then one on video. And then this last one just been published on inclusion in the Pocket Handbook series. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
I'm interested just before we get on to the actual topic of the book, because
Mm,
this is watched by materials writers. This is
yeah,
called a pocket book,
yeah,
but you can see that I ordered a copy. It's full of post-it notes with
yeah.
notes and questions and queries, which we're not going to cover in the
Mm,
15 minutes we have. Um, but it's pocket size, but it's incredibly dense, and I mean
yeah.
it in an incredibly positive way.
Yeah, thanks for
I mean,
saying
it's
that.
really widely researched. You
Mm,
kind of go into all sorts of different areas, many
mm,
which hadn't occurred to me. How long did this take you to research
mm.
and write?
Yeah, it's a bit of a labor of love, to be honest. It's a kind of passion of mine, really. I mean, I think I just really felt there was a need for a book on a kind of all-encompassing, holistic book on inclusion. And Cambridge approached me, and we sort of took it from there. But it took a very long time to write because, and actually this is quite interesting. My initial proposal, which is to cut a very long story short, is this idea of looking at inclusion from a holistic perspective, meaning the whole person, the rather than rather than focusing on particular identities. Was a little bit controversial to start with, believe it or not. Some of the reviewers of the book initially wanted there to be chapters on, LGBTQI plus and in indigenous peoples and neurodiversity. And I was very adamant that I didn't want to do that, that I wanted the book not to focus on, because that seemed to me actually to be exclusive, you know. That the idea is not to ignore these categories and identities, of course not, but to try to look at inclusion from a much broader picture point of view.
Well, that connects with some of the things you say for writers to consider that if
Yeah,
we want our materials to be more inclusive, not to actually focus in on a single identity.
yeah,
In that way, it's almost that's counterproductive. It leads to things
yeah,
like tokenism and stuff. Before
exactly.
we go down
Mm,
to that, I mean, obviously, my first question is because I've been to many talks on inclusion and I'm still left wondering exactly what it is.
mm.
So when I picked up the book, the first thing I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to look for Ben's definition. But of
Mm.
course, you actually start the book by saying inclusion is a complex term to define,
Yeah,
has become politically loaded. It involves us discussing a number of key interrelated concepts. These are therefore best defined from the start. And then we get
yeah,
subheadings like diversity, equality, equity,
yeah.
inclusion, social justice, belonging, intersectionality. So I'm going to ask you to do exactly what you don't want to do in the book, which is tell me and sort of try to get me in a sort of bite-sized chunk. What do you mean by inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, it is extremely complex. It also means different things to different people in different contexts. That is absolutely true. Um, but essentially, inclusion is the appreciation and let's say the identification and an attempt to remove the barriers that people face in life. So an inclusive practice in our context in teaching um, language is to consider. when you walk into a classroom or when you're writing materials, the people using the materials, to consider that enormous variability that exists within any student cohort. Uh, but you really can't. It's really to do with identifying and attempting to remove those barriers. But those barriers are multifaceted, obviously, and we all have barriers. We've all faced barriers in our life. We've all faced barriers in our learning. The thing is that inclusion is always associated, or nearly always associated, with these two other big concepts: diversity and equity. So, as I'm sure you know, departments like, well, most companies these days have departments named EDI or DEI, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you can't really talk about inclusion without talking about equity and diversity. It's almost impossible. In actual fact, inclusion is kind of bringing those two other concepts together as well. So I hope I'm making sense, but to kind of to say it succinctly, equity is uh, giving everyone what they need to succeed. Um, and obviously, that's not the same as equality, which is giving everyone the same. And it's amazing how those two terms are confused still. And when you look up EDI or DEI, you look up the acronym and what it stands for, it's amazing that still, in many, many cases, it stands for equality. And really, it should stand for equity, giving everyone what they need. Because if you give everyone the same, obviously, we won't all reach the same place because we all start at different places.
Hmm.
And diversity is the kind of, let's say, of the three concepts, perhaps the easiest to define, which is just sort of the appreciation and celebration of diverse identities. And if there's any of those three terms, which is which in terms of materials writing, I think the diversity is the one which is the easiest one to grasp for materials writers. So what we should be aiming for is diverse representation in our materials.
If we, okay, so we're getting towards the what. If we were to ask the question why,
Mm.
if I'm a language teacher or I'm a materials writer and I come back to you with the question, well, this is all fine, but my
Yeah.
job is to deliver language,
Yeah.
focus on English teaching. Is
Mm.
this another thing on top of a whole load of other things that have come from education stuff that I now have to include in my classroom?
Mm.
What would be your response to that kind of line of questioning?
Well, I think I think in that respect, it's not no different to the role of inclusive practice in society in general. So we want, I mean, yes, we are writing material in the case of materials writing, honing it down a bit. Yes, we are writing materials for language learning essentially, and we need that grammar and the lexis and the skills and so on. But all of this takes place in a context, or it should take place in a context. So unless you're just doing some very boring mechanical self-study activities, no. So that context is extremely important. So where the context in which students come across this language, attempt to and attempt to use it is fundamental. I think the important thing is that students need to be able to see themselves
Mm.
in material. So we've all, everyone knows that material, you'll get better results if students are engaged and if the material is relevant to them. But what does that mean exactly? Well, I think it largely means that they can relate to it and having relatable material, I think, means considering that variability that we just described at the beginning, that diversity and variability. So when I first started writing materials 25 years ago, it is 25 years ago, that's scary. It was still, I mean, it was still British and American culture that dominated, yeah. And there was I even wrote a book, which the first book that I wrote, a course book, which they made an edition of the book for Greece and put Big Ben on the cover. Because those that 25 years ago, it was still understood that if you wanted to study in many contexts, anyway, in many cultures, that if you wanted to study English, then you also wanted to study all the elements of Anglo-American culture as well. And of course, an inclusive approach is the antithesis to that. It's about moving away from that focus on target culture and embracing diversity and showing showing and diverse contexts and hearing diverse voices.
Yeah, I think, and it comes up as somewhere in your book. I was reading along and suddenly saw the words nuance and complexity. And it was the two words that we also did another interview with Dr. Amina Douidi. She's talking about
Mm,
interculturalism, and she says the issue is how do we get the nuance and complexity in the
yeah,
materials? Because rather than at the beginning, you said people want a chapter on that bit, and then on that bit, it's more nuanced and complex. And if
yeah,
you're choosing a reading text about somebody who there may be some aspect of their life which is particular, but you want to show it within the much wider context. So the text isn't just about disability or some
yeah.
otherness. It's the nuance and complexity of their life, and it's much richer, and that we're trying to get that in the text. And we're seeing because
Mm.
it's interesting when I've worked on course series and we've removed, if you like, the Big Ben culture and the London culture. We then had for the second edition had teachers saying, "Hey, where's all the stuff about
Yeah.
London and the UK gone?" It's
Yeah,
like
you can go too far.
so it's got to be nuanced. It's got to have sort of complexity in it, kind of thing. So you still can
Yeah.
have the UK, but it's got to be presented in have other things within it. There's your interesting quote, Philip Kerr's writing about how in the sort of 2000s that materials writing and also teaching is coming from a white Anglocentric
Mm.
male-dominated heteronormative perspective.
Mm.
And the irony isn't lost on me that we're two white males talking about it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. At least I'm Jewish and gay.
um, so it is that sort of complexity. But I think for teachers and
Yeah.
writers, that's quite challenging. We could go in all sorts of
Yeah.
directions, but I'm going to jump specifically in terms of how we might integrate this into
Yeah.
materials writing.
Yeah.
We do have a section in the book on page 85
Hmm.
which is about writing and using materials, and you have sort of six key principles. So I think it's
Yeah.
valuable to sort of quickly explore those. Number one
Mm.
is tie materials to inclusive representation. This
Yeah.
means that all identities, narratives, and realities should be represented equitably and authentically and not be challenged. Do you want to, in terms
Mm.
of if I was writing a piece of material, how might that be
Yeah. That's
reflected?
very, I mean, it is actually very hard to do that if you don't. So if you're writing about a culture which you don't have any personal experience of, this is very difficult to do without falling into othering or stereotyping or trivializing tokenism, all these different
Mhm.
problems that arise when we try to be inclusive. I mean, I think I can't remember if it's one of those six ideas now, but the that line, don't speak about us without us, is a very powerful message, and I think it's very important if you do want to talk about a particular community or culture to go to authentic voices of members of that community for your source text. Now that isn't always easy to do, but I think that should be and that's recognized as a very good strategy
There's a really
because
interesting
yeah,
part of your book where you have case studies,
yes, that's the
and
one.
you just made
Yeah,
me think about the one from Tanya
yeah,
Patterson.
yeah,
She's describing that she wants to write some material for about produce materials for Indigenous children in Canada.
yeah,
Started to research it, and
exactly.
she started to doubt whether she,
So
without any experience and without their perspective, was actually able to write it.
yeah, yeah. I
Um,
know the really interesting thing about that case study, John, is that she had no choice. The interesting thing about that is that she didn't choose to write about that topic, but it was in the curriculum. She had to cover it. And that's another issue that's important that in many contexts, obviously inclusive materials are part and parcel of curriculums. and in Canada, because of what happened, the atrocities that happened to these Indigenous children, there's this Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and there's a day where these people's these poor kids' lives are celebrated, or let's say that are not forgotten what happened to them. And because of that, she had to prepare material, and as you said, in that case study is very interesting. She felt completely unable. She felt, I'm not even Canadian, let alone I have no contact with these people. And so she did go she went to an authentic source of a person who lived through that, who is now adult, of course, but was a kid at the time and was removed from their home. Um, and and I think that is a very interesting case study for that reason, because she felt that she could not do the topic justice approaching it from a way that she may approach other material, because there is an element of trauma in that particular. Now, not all inclusive materials have to be of that traumatic nature, not at all. But that was certainly the case in with Tanya.
I was describing this to a friend. She's a journalist. She's written for Newsweek and
Mm.
Time magazine. And when she was asking me about what I was doing, and at the time I was working on some video material and we were interviewing people from different parts of the Amazon. And I was
Mm.
describing how I'd spent my working day. And she said, "So you're doing journalism basically." And I'd never really seen it that way, but I realized that a lot of the skills, as if you like,
Yeah.
people to say good journalists here, we can apply as materials writers. It's about, and I think video is
Mm.
particularly good for this in course materials where you're interviewing somebody and you're actually hearing the real
Yeah.
voice, not just the
Yeah.
accent and the English, but also the perspective that you can get in video if you just let someone
Mm.
speak. That's a massive development in language learning materials in a way, because you can just
Yeah.
hand it over. Your job is just to kind of get the dialogue going and ask the right kind of questions and so on.
But that's another issue, though, that's very important to consider. That, what are the questions that you're asking, and if they're not, they could be leading questions.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
that's I mean, you can get easily tangled up in all of this stuff. And there are you can't just say, oh, because it's the authentic voice, then it's okay. Obviously it's better than a third person's perspective, an outsider's perspective looking in, perhaps a privileged person's perspective looking in on the case of another marginalized identity or whatever. It's always going to be better to hear that voice. But of course, you have to remember how those voices are framed, and who does the framing, and you know.
Sure, and you're
Hmm.
getting one perspective, and I think you talk about this in the book that you've got to
Yeah,
have it's more than just one perspective. You've got to get
yeah,
a range of perspectives in the material.
yeah,
But I certainly feel more comfortable about that than, say, me writing about
yeah,
it in a reading text, for example, because I'm seeing it through a certain frame, through a certain prism,
exactly.
kind of thing. Another key principle you've got, which you're picking up on Tyson
Hmm.
Seburn's work, about
Yeah.
this, consider the approach you take to identities, narratives, and realities.
Hmm.
You make this distinction, or Tyson makes this distinction of usualization and disruption. Do you just want to
Hmm.
explain that?
Yeah, this is a key. This is, I think, maybe of all of these ideas or principles of inclusive materials writing, I think this perhaps is the most important one. Because certainly when I first started trying to be inclusive with the materials, I definitely took a disruptive approach. And the disruptive approach essentially means that you make a big thing of talking about this particular community. So let's say it's the LGBTQI plus whatever community, and you want to introduce and you want to talk about gay identities or queer identities, or whatever label you want to use. If it was a disruptive approach, then you'd go for it. It'd be in the students and teachers' face. You'd have a rainbow flag there, and there'd be a person talking about how, coming out or whatever, and there may be two or three different other people talking about what it was like to come out as a gay person or whatever. That would be the disruptive approach, where you are in your materials, you're making a big thing of it, and you're kind of asking students to think about the topic critically and to question it. Um, and that is not obviously appropriate in many, in fact, it's not appropriate at all in many internationally published materials, as we know, and we can go on and talk about that later if we have time.
Mm.
But that disruptive approach certainly is what does go on in many classrooms where teachers take the materials and try to make it more inclusive and make it more disruptive by focusing on identities which are not actually in the materials themselves, but they let's say adapt the materials to make them more inclusive and more disruptive. The other approaches which you referred to is the utilization approach, and this is very different. This is where just one voice, it could be and it could be an LGBT voice, is kind of embedded in a context with other voices talking about their identities or talking about whatever it is the topic is, um, and there is no that voice is not highlighted in any way. It's treated in exactly the same way as the other voices. What's the difference there? The difference is that the marginalized identity is just placed alongside other identities, some of which may be marginalized, some of which may not be. Again, that's always a bit subjective. And so the students, when they come across that material, they're not encouraged to look at it in any way as exotic or different or special or taboo or any of these or anything like that. They're just seeing it as one voice alongside others. And we call it utilization because it should seem usual for that representative to be there alongside other representatives. You see what I mean? And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
it's a huge difference. It's a very, very different approach. And I have tried in my career as a writer, because I'm working for international, global ELT publishers, to kind of include those voices, obviously in a usualized way, because it would not be possible in a disruptive way, and it might not be desirable either in a disruptive way in internationally published materials anyway, because you may be obliging a teacher to talk about topics that they may not feel comfortable talking about. So
No, I mean, I've had that in feedback where we've included topics and I thought I was doing the right thing. And actually, in the
yeah,
feedback in the next edition, a lot of teachers said, I'm
yeah,
really uncomfortable dealing with this. I don't
that's
know how to deal with it in the classroom.
exactly.
And you're bringing up potential difficulties,
Yeah,
particularly
that's
in
the problem with the
classrooms with,
disruptive approach. Mm,
yeah, and you've got students from different cultural
yeah.
backgrounds, that kind of mixed cultures. It's teachers can feel that actually the material's putting them in quite a difficult position. Yeah, that's tricky.
Yeah, and it could be a particular, it's very difficult sometimes to, as I'm sure the whole concept of inclusion for many people is very highly politicized.
Mm.
And especially in the United States at the moment, and the whole idea of that it's woke and what does woke mean and so on. And this is again one of the dangers of appearing to be too disruptive, is that you are also, and I think one of the six principles is not to you know, force students or teachers to um, follow. I'm not sure if that's the right word. A
Yeah,
particular
you've got
ideology.
kind of
Yeah,
got two here. You've got
yeah,
principles 5 and 6. You've got 5, don't impose your own values or opinions on the materials,
mm,
sort of asking leading questions.
yeah,
But there's also 6, don't allow particular representations to make somebody reveal more about themselves
oh
than they
yeah,
wish to. So you may be bringing an issue into the classroom, which is then encouraging students to say something about themselves, which
yeah,
they don't necessarily want to. I mean. That's true in all sorts of ways, isn't it? Students don't
yeah.
want to say personal things about their lives.
And then I think number 5 is that don't impose your own values or opinions in the
Yeah,
material. So that's what I meant. I think that's the really important one, because again, and it's a very delicate balance. As you said, there's a lot of nuance here.
yeah,
For what somebody who reads the New York Times or someone who reads the Guardian or whatever, talking about a particular topic from a certain angle may seem completely normal, but for another person, they may be seeing it as ideologically manipulative, and it's very, very dangerous to assume that because if you explain the concept of inclusion, most people in the English language teaching profession are going to agree with its central principles. Yeah, I mean, if you think about equity, diversity,
Most people have
but
done a TEFL conference.
right, yeah,
That's
exactly,
different from
yeah,
globally, yeah. But
yeah.
yeah.
No, but I mean, if you just unpack those three terms that I, in the way that I unpack them, diversity, equity, and inclusion, even then, most people, I think, would accept that this is something that we should, follow, But within that, it's a very complex world, and you do need to be very careful how you frame and contextualize materials, so that you are not imposing a voice, and that is often a real challenge.
Perhaps a key principle number three is an important one, I think, to mention. It
Mm.
says consult authentic real life sources and
Ah,
make
yeah,
these the focus. And for me, this is in the last 20 years, as I've thought more and more about this is central to me that
mm.
I'm trying to find either material that's authentic, but the actual information in it is authentic and the people are authentic, and that you're
Mm.
just giving voice to other people rather than me sort of framing it through my perspective. That seems to me, if you can find the text which tells a personal story and you're not presenting
Yeah,
it as this is everybody within a certain group, this is representation of one person, their perspective, that
yeah.
seems to me very important. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and the good news is that there are more of these authentic voices out there, and there are some sites now. I quote a couple of them. There's one particular one that I think is very, very was a great initiative, which is this site called the Stories That Move. You
Mhm.
mentioned stories just now, and it's basically interviews with actually it's mainly teenagers actually, from different marginalized communities, and their voices are again, a lot of the topics. There's no sugarcoating. A lot of it is quite tough. A lot of the narratives are hard to take, but it is very real. And I think, and I've done some work for them, created some materials for them that teachers can download.
Just anybody who's interested in seeing
Mm.
you talk about the book and on this topic,
Yeah,
I know that you've been traveling quite a bit,
yeah.
but where are you heading in the next? Are you still giving talks on the topic in the next
Yeah,
few
no,
months?
absolutely. Yeah, well, funnily enough, I'm going to the United States, where the topic of inclusion is could not be more politicized. So that would be very interesting to see, um, talking about that issue there. I've been recently in Uzbekistan,
Mhm.
also talking about the topic, and again, it really, 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 really enriching these experiences, because you realize, the echo chamber that you inhabit, when you because inclusion, to somebody in one culture can just mean something completely different. Talk about inclusive practice. When I was in Uzbekistan, and it was, it's people talking about, yeah, apart from cognitive and physical disability, neurodiversity, and so on. It's all, rural communities, and people without, digital divide,
Yeah.
and different languages and ethnic communities, so minorities and so on. And so very different from how, here in Spain where I live, we talk about inclusion, we wouldn't necessarily hear those communities mentioned. So it is very important the context in which you're talking about it. I'm going to be at IATEFL on a panel for Cambridge, talking about inclusive practice as well. And further along, Brazil in July as well.
Okay.
Uh,
Excellent.
so thanks
Well,
very much.
hopefully
Yeah,
by doing this, more people
yeah,
will see you and we'll
yeah.
be sharing the video out there. And it's the kind of topic that I think a lot of people will have views and comments on. So we may be hashtagging you in some of
No, please do. Please
the
hashtag
posts.
away. Yeah, no, it's been lovely. Been really interesting talking to you about it. And thanks for the invitation. As I said, it's been a pleasure.